Hi everyone. It's great to be here, and it has been lovely to meet some colleagues from old time, Gaby, for example, and Brian, which we have been working together in Umeå earlier, so it's great to be here. Maybe I should mention something about my background as an historian, because that will be a part of my presentation today. We have had several colleagues here making presentations and bringing in sort of their perspective on things, and I will use also my background in my presentation today. And as you have observed, we have had some technical issues here. I have tried, in fact, to solve them the last 3 days, but we entered a new level of complication recently, but now it's solved partly, at least. I will try to do my best here. This week started out with Karin, who introduced us. She told us something about her life story and how to get into this. We listened to Valerie, we met other colleagues who brought in their perspective. And I will try to add to this by sharing some thoughts on the relationship between democracy and education from our perspective. I will focus on schooling. I will focus in one part on teacher education, and I will give some examples from higher education of different kinds. So that is something of what I will try to do today. And I would like you to think about both education and democracy from a perspective of fragility, of something that is not that robust as we usually think. And why, I will tell you something why I think this is important. I grew up in Umeå. The schools I went to look pretty much like today as they did when I was there. It gave me an impression that, yeah, schools are in that way forever. That is sort of what schools are. I grew up in a middle-class family, not particularly interested in politics, or to say not at all interested in such things, and I was pretty unaware of those things when I grew up. In the end 70s, I met a young girl. She ended up to be my wife and mother of our kids, and sort of, and we're still together. And through her, I become aware of that in 2 or 3 hours by a car from where I grew up, that was totally different living conditions. What was most interesting was conversation with my mother-in-law for decades. She was not that particularly interested in telling the story of her life, but you know, you could bring pieces together year after year. And with the exception of my wife, they had the first 4 children she raised. They were raised without electricity, without telephones, without a road, in a landscape, in a small village, without a road. Things that we pretty much think that is sort of where we have everywhere, anyway. For her, democracy was an extremely important thing. It was not a theory. It was about giving opportunities. It gave her a voice, gave her security, gave her a better life. And that is not that long ago. So I would like us to have that in mind, that because we are a different age in this room at the moment, but we have all more or less grow up in situations, I guess, which makes us, maybe that it creates difficulties to understand the tremendous shift from going from both poverty and low levels of democracy to more better living and democracy. And there are many perspectives in this, and I just want to have us this in mind, this tremendous change, which we probably are not always aware of. So that's why I propose to have this concept of fragility with us in this lecture. This is some of you recognize this quote as one of the most classic in education, and I couldn't really think about entering this kind of talk without using this, at least reminding us about it, because I started to think, what would it be to not do that? You know, the opposite kind of question. I would though take another road at the moment. I would say that we are now in the end of this week. We have listened to a lot, you have read a lot of text, we have had those seminars, we have had these workshops, and we have been discussing, you have made your presentation, this is what I do in my research, we have been talking about that. Much focus on kind of outcome from those programs in terms of the dissertation, the paper, the piece of knowledge. But I would like you also to change perspective now and think about that the outcome is something else. The outcome is in fact that, from my perspective, is that we train a new generation of researchers. So the program is, and this seminar is not about the text, the piece of research you do. It's more about what kind of researchers you would like to be, where you are heading, etc., etc. So that would be the kind of other perspective I would like you to have in mind, that those themes on democracy and diversity, etc., it has to do with you as becoming researchers as well. Okay, now I try to move over to another aspect here, to the purpose of today. I saw recently, this kind of interview program. They approached people on the street. So, what do you think about the purpose of schooling and things like that? And this was I had opportunity to catch the voices. So we had this kind of responses from people. To promote equality, the traditional, to teach things, to learn about right and wrong, it's about moral, to bring people together and share views, it's about learning, respect for others, to show kids that they also count and that they can make a difference. There were some voices on the street in Sweden recently. I would like you to, for 2 minutes, on your table, to have a short discussion on what could be the characteristics of a democratic school. What could be characteristics of a democratic school? Just 2 minutes. Okay?
Yes, you can turn around here. I'll be part of this discussion. Yes. So, yeah. Did you get the question, Frank? Yes, yes. How up to a democratic school? Att vi har det lite.
Det kan handla om att man skulle kunna säga att man är vidare.
So how far am I allowed to be? How far am I allowed to go without any? Okay. I just wanted to know whether I leave now.
It would be equal and the right to be different.
Continue in English. Frank can be a part of it as well.
Okay. Okay. Hello.
Yes. Yeah. No. Björn,
Just throw out some concepts or ideas, please. Something that could be a characteristic of a democratic school. Yes, please.
We should be free, friendly, with authorities, democratically elected, and diverse.
Okay. Okay. Someone will add something? Yeah?
More informal spaces to bring awkward voices together.
Okay.
Students feel they have a stake.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
I have found a sentence that said that the opportunity to be equal and the right to be different.
Thank you for that. Okay. You know, the advantage of promising someone that you will give a talk in 2 or 3 or 6 months or so is that you have to concentrate your thoughts on it. So now and then you have to sit down, and I will share with you, I sat down one day and I was sort of thinking, democratic school. And I was putting down sort of the democratic function of a school. What kind of idea is that? And and I was thinking about democratic working methods as well as teaching methods, and what constitutes such methods. I was thinking about emancipation, solidarity, etc. I was thinking about whether group-centered teaching always are more democratic than what? This kind of thinking. I was thinking about a school with democratic aims and purposes. What constitutes such kind of purpose, in essence? What is that? What is the kind of relationship there are between democratic purposes and workforce, professional-oriented aims, for example, within a school organization? A school, I was thinking, a democratic school in terms of democratic results or outputs, and I hesitate with those terms. I was thinking, but given that, what is that? How to measure that? How can we understand that? A school with a democratic content, what could that be? You could just dig in, and the ocean gets deeper the more you go. And I guess your conversations have proved that as well. We skip that. What was interesting though was that I went back to one old, and I walked with my bookshelf, and I was thinking, what was I taught when I was trained to become a teacher? And this was what we were provided with. The democratic school shall provide good schooling for all, should be organized and work in accordance with democratic ideals and values, shall transmit democratic ideals and values, shall by its existence and mode of operation be a democratic force, democratizing force. I found this pretty interesting. The guy who sort of proposed this definition had been working in sort of the post-war period and having a lot of influence. So that is sort of where I can think about this. A bit worried about that one. Okay, I think we try to make a shortcut. Bear with me. As an historian, I was thinking, when I was going through this, I ended up over here. And I was thinking that, yes, we could think about democracy. I just skipped the part where we discussed what democracy could be. I guess we don't have to do that. I was thinking about this classical division between means and ends and forms and contents. But as an historian, those perspectives of continuity and change and the critical perspective by whom for whom becomes really important. So I will ask you to have this with us in the next minutes here to think about this. The next thing I had on my paper was, why is it good with democracy? Why are we interested in democracy? And I went to this into the literature, and I just present this from Robert Darwin from his volume on democracy, where he proposed 10 desirable consequences as arguments for why this is important. To avoid tyranny, to provide essential rights, general freedom, opportunity for self-determination, moral autonomy, human development, protecting essential personal interests, political equality. And then, he said, in addition, modern democracy can produce peace-seeking and prosperity. We can have discussions whether this is always the case, etc. Oh, sorry. Did it change that? No? Okay. Okay. This is the tricky part when having things in different spaces. So, okay, let me see. Oh, now it's there. Okay, now it's there. Okay. So I think we need to have those things with us. And what I would like to say is that if we think about those desirable aspects from two different positions, we can think about it from the position of being close to the top politicians. We can think about it from being in a less advantaged position, maybe as unemployed, etc. And think about, if we would like to make change, if we would like to support the chances for those desirable consequences to happen, in which situation is the absolute top task to do to inform 7-year-old kids about this? if we would like to head for political equality, which situation is the most important thing to talk with very small kids in a kind of organization called school, that this is important? I can see from your faces that you become a bit puzzled. I'm just trying to say something very, I think, maybe naive, but we who are working in educational contexts usually have very high appreciation of democracy, and we think it's a really important thing of what we do. But we also have to think about that what is the consequence when society in a kind of push for democracy says that yes, that would be a task for the school to make that come true? Is that a sign of really engage for democracy, or for saying this is a tricky thing we don't really know how to do, but we can have them talk over here about it, and it is a nice idea, so it would be a good thing if all kids start to think it's a nice idea. You know, we put in education sometimes things that we really don't know how to handle in society. And I just want you to have that in mind. I'm not saying that it is not important. I'm saying that maybe it's too important to only be a thing for education. Okay? Because we could step in from decisions in parliament, etc., and make in conversation in parliament, etc., and make decisions on, human rights, sort of, and things like that. And we can make other things than talk in school about this to make them come true. So, okay. Now we have, okay. We shift focus now. I told you that I am a historian, so now we have to spend some minutes in Swedish history. What's wrong with this map? Yeah, you could, if you assume that Sweden is the green part, which is the idea with the map, there is something which is obvious, that it is not the contemporary picture. This is Sweden in the 1660s, when the usually kind of, squarish kind of Sweden was a round thing. It was a country around an ocean, like a highway, etc., etc. And this is in a period when Sweden by chance had become, if not an imperial power, it had imperial ambition. It launched war after war. No one, I guess, was thinking that was fun, but they still did it. I can tell you something more about that later, but as we are late in time, I won't. But the interesting part of this was that since this time, Sweden was in a kind of,
Deterioration.
exactly, losing war after war after war. Happily so for many, and so just in the beginning of the 1800s, Sweden again launched a war. There is someone over here, which is all those are usually Swedish enemies, but the particular enemy was Russia. We need to go against Russia. So Sweden went again towards Russia. They had been beaten 100 years before, but was thinking that, we do it again. So Sweden lost the war in 1809. In fact, close to Umeå, the final battle was. That is another interesting story what happened locally. But Sweden lost not only the war, they lost. At that time, they lost other areas. They lost Finland, which was huge sort of trauma for Sweden. But that was not the whole story. At the same time, there was a coup in Stockholm. The king had to resign, and in some months they established a new constitution, shifting from democratic rule toward, if not a democratic rule, a little bit sort of widening opportunities for others to have a say in things. So, I will try to show you something of a pattern. Now we have to go back a little bit further. And look here. That what I just told you about when we were here. What was the history before? Yes, if we start in the 1700s, Sweden had also at that time launched a war and lost, and there became a turmoil. And at that time, there had to become a shift from the situation where the power rests with the king to the power rests in the council and the parliament, kind of a private council, you know. In the 77s, we had a similar thing ongoing, and there was totally a shift in where the power rests. And we had it again in 1809. So there was a history of, huge change. So what was interesting was that when the parliament in 1809 was gathered, there was a member of parliament who had an idea. This was more or less what he said. This new and very important constitution is in need of support and defense. And the very idea for him was that he made a long argument, but he said, we haven't had a school system that supports this kind of constitution. And we need to have that, because otherwise we will end up in this situation. For the future existence of the state, it is essential that the foundation for education and the constitution are in perfect harmony. He also argued like this, because he had ideas of what that kind of education should be. Do not the farmer need other knowledge than what is provided in the catechism? Because that's what schooling was about. Do the catechism make him wiser in his daily work? Do the catechism teach him his duties and rights as a citizen? Does it enlighten him fully on what moral relations it comes with living in a community? No, it did not. The interesting thing is that they had really, really advanced ideas. So in the parliament they decided, yes, we need to establish a committee. And it was a committee with quite a number of radicals, and it was called the Genius Committee, because what was at the time best and the brightest. And they were, of course, you could guess what they were influenced by. The situation in France, of course, etc., etc. That committee gathered in 1812. When it became dissolved in the 1820s, they were all conservatives. They took a stance of another kind, and these ideas were never realized. But I think it's interesting that already in 1809, really important ideas was voiced in the Swedish parliament. And we could, that's a long story. My point here is that when we are interested in finding out something about the democratic school, it consists of elements, which it is not the case that it suddenly occurs, but the elements are there in conversation for a long period of time. The interesting thing is when pieces will be put together, we will have something called the democratic school. Now I will go a little bit further in history and turn more to the educational aspect. So we now have been talking the earlier part here. I will say something, maybe I will not. Okay. There is a long, interesting history and maybe, I guess you're all familiar with this. After the First World War, with all the terrible things that had happened, it is really interesting how in Sweden the conversation started out that schools need to be part of creating peace. There was an interesting movement, for example, revising the curricula for history studies. In the Nordic countries, they start to send textbooks to the neighbors with this kind of question: is there anything in our history textbooks that maybe are offensive for you? And they start to work to think, okay, we need to change teaching in history. Let me see if I can give it this. This is now in the 20s. That teachers, when addressing issues like war, they have to emphasize that war nowadays has come to be understood as a disaster, and that focus should be on the pain and affliction, the suffering that war causes. So what happens out there have a direct consequence in the classroom. It may be also be interesting to note, they had this always when you change something with the religious education in school, there is a huge turmoil. But this is interesting that they decided that teachers need to pay attention to individual pupils. Why? Because it's a compulsory school. It is not optional, so it's a compulsory thing. So there will be kids of all kinds from different traditions. Teachers need to avoid offensiveness that can be hurting to the individual according to his philosophy of life, and that can impede the development of warm-hearted tolerance towards people's differences in respect. And the teachers are warned they should not teach against the emphasis in contemporary society of freedom of thought. So I think that is really important, and this was launched in the 20s. So if we go back to this is some part of that, and of course you all can imagine the impact of the Second World War. This is a really interesting, I would say, exercise that happens to when the school system, when we in Sweden and in other countries try to understand how can we change schools so that will not happen. On the other hand, how can we change schools into becoming democratic schools? And it is amazing that some of the ideas from this period, they were not really come true until end 1960s. My youngest son is today, he's having his 25th birthday today. I can think about him as, it was recently he showed up. It's this kind of strange thing, as if he, that was an interesting sign, okay. The point I make with this is that in 1962, with some changes in 1969, was maybe the time when a democratic school would become established in Sweden. In 1985, we had an educational act that explicitly addressed those things. If you add 25 years from when those decisions were made on a democratic, comprehensive school in Sweden, that was the time when there were not any major argument to change the system into something else. But they came after 25 years. And I would say that the process which we entered in the 80s deeply questions whether we still have a democratic school system. As the core ideas of bringing in students, kids from all social classes into the same experiences is not there anymore. And that is a foundational aspect of this. So, just give me a second, or in fact John gave me 10, so I will try to. My idea was to present some argument here. I think we just go over here. It is because I would like to say something about, I said that we could think about the democratic school in terms of content and form, means and ends and things like that. And the decades, the post-war decades was very much of establishing the form. And then there came the question of what working methods, what would be inside here to make it to be truly democratic. And it is interesting what kind of ideas that were connected to this school reform. Listen to the words of Olof Palme. He was Minister of Education. In fact, he was Minister of Ecclesiastical Affairs, but that was where we had education at the time. For him, the schools were the spearheads into the future, and it was the key to abolish the class society. That was how he sort of approached education. That was the idea he was nurturing about education. It had to do with a better society. It had to do with shaping democratically minded citizens. If you compare this with the spirit of today, then the argument is that Sweden, not the future, Sweden is in focus. If Sweden should be in the front among knowledge nations, we have to be among the best in math and technology. If Sweden should be a successful industrial nation in the 20th centuries, the industry has to be provided with qualified labor force. So those parts changed into those parts, which this is aspects of course, what Louise Nagel has addressed earlier. But I think it's so interesting how it shows up in our national debate as well. Deep side.
I'm sorry.
I can share that with you. And I also
Not for you, but for kind of...
Yeah, but also in the situation, where to go to make this. I think I have to. I think we skipped those parts I was wanting to talk about.
No, don't do that.
No. Just give me 2 words, 2 minutes. I skipped some parts there, as you noticed. And let me put it like this, which also sort of emphasized conversation we have had earlier here, that higher education was maybe a very important aspect of society prior to 1945. But as was shown yesterday, sort of small numbers attending that. So I would say that we have to reflect upon, we who are active in higher ed, to think about higher education's role in a democratic society, given the fact that more or less half of all young people comes into higher education. It's a kind of a requirement for many important posts. I have done a study on the strategic work within higher education institutions, where they were all at the same time asked to make their analysis of the current situation in globally, and what was the challenge they found in this institution. And that's all Sweden, there are kind of 40 higher education institutions in Sweden. They differ from extremely small to extremely large, specialized, broad, all kind of parameters, difference, age, and everything. But they just had one idea. And that was more or less in the vocabulary Louise focused on yesterday, on the knowledge economy and that kind of agenda. They were not addressing issues on democracy at all. No. There were no reflection, sort of thinking about what is our role in a democratic society. And I found that hugely problematic because the shifting situation from being a marginal activity to one of the main societal activities, it really calls for all institutions to reflect on this. Not only sort of when it comes to working method, teaching program, whatever, but as an institution, as a role in society. And to try to end somewhere, this seminar week has also been about you as students. You are all sort of professionals already and with a lot of working experience, but it's very much about your research, where to go, what to do, but it's also about who you are becoming. What is the role of a researcher in a democratic society? What kind of obligations do we have? What kind of roles would we like to take to be an important and honest factor in society? There are some really pretty interesting reading to do on this, and it is an important part of becoming not only an expert in those fields we are studying, but in becoming a researcher. You will all be in 10 years' time working in a very interesting and important sector of society. And you will be part of this change relationship between society and education, society, democracy. You will become part of that, and you need to be aware of that. You need to think through what kind of role, what kind of more or less identity do you like to have in the future? Because that creates not only you, it creates the institutions, and together where we are going, where we would like to go, that constitutes who we would like to be as a society. Thank you.